Hey, you, the one with the mop. The voice, sharp and laced with arrogance, sliced through the relative quiet of the advanced class's late session. It belonged to Derek Mitchell, a man whose identity was so fused with his black belt that it seemed to be the source of his very spine. He stood, legs apart, in the dead center of the mat, a smug emperor in his small, self-made kingdom. How about a little demonstration for my students? Derek's voice boomed, a theatrical performance for the 8 students scattered around him. I want to show them the vast, unbridgeable chasm between a warrior and, well, a janitor. A few of his students snickered, the sound tinny and uncomfortable in the cavernous space. Others shifted their weight, their eyes darting anywhere but at the man being singled out. James Washington, aged 42, let the mop handle rest against a wall, the dripping gray strings a stark contrast to the pristine white of the mat. He'd only been at this job for 3 weeks, a ghost who materialized after the last student had bowed out, leaving only the lingering scent of effort and ambition. He methodically worked his way across the floor, a slow, rhythmic dance of cleansing. Tonight, however, the advanced class had run late, and the two worlds meant to be separate had collided. He looked up, his movements unhurried, almost deliberate. His face, a roadmap of quiet miles, remained placid. "No need to trouble yourself, Sensei," James replied, his voice a low, calm rumble that seemed to absorb the tension rather than reflect it. "I'm just about done here. I'll be out of your way." He turned his attention back to a stubborn black scuff mark, his focus absolute. Derek let out a braying laugh that echoed with forced mirth. "Hear that, everyone?" The man scared to even look at the mat. He strode towards James, his feet slapping the mat with an aggressive rhythm. "Come on, old man. Don't you want to show these kids what a real fight looks like? Oh, wait." He paused for dramatic effect. "I bet you've never even been in a real fight in your life, have you?" The question hung in the air, thick and rancid. What Derek, in his cocoon of unexamined privilege, couldn't possibly know was that James Washington had spent the last 2 decades in a self-imposed exile, trying to silence the ghosts of 1,000 real fights. 20 years since a ring, a roar, and a tragedy had shattered his world, leaving him with a secret buried so deep, even his own daughter knew nothing of the man her father used to be. Just a quick educational demonstration. Derek pressed, his smile a predatory slash. He was closer now, invading James's personal space. "I bet you can't even form a proper guard. Let's show my students why there's a hierarchy, why some people train to conquer, and others just clean up the mess." A flicker in James's chest. A dormant muscle, long atrophied from disuse, twitched with a phantom memory. His eyes, deep and patient, met Derek's. For a nanosecond, something ancient and formidable passed between them, a silent communication that made the self-assured sensei take an involuntary half-step back. The air crackled, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to dip, the shadows deepening. Derek, recovering his swagger, tried to mask the sudden tremor of uncertainty in his voice. "Just for the beginners, you understand? To show them the importance of respecting the art." James slowly, deliberately placed his mop and bucket to the side. He stood up to his full height, and the simple action was imbued with a grace, a fluid economy of motion that was utterly incongruous with the role of a janitor. Around the gym, the remaining students stopped their own training, their attention drawn to the silent, unfolding drama. A young woman with her hair in a tight bun, Sarah Chun, exchanged a worried glance with her training partner, who shook his head in disgust. "All right," James said at last. His voice was the calm surface of a deep lake just before a storm breaks. "But on one condition. When this is over, you will stand in that same spot, and you will apologize to every one of your students for degrading this dojo into a cheap circus." Derek's laugh this time was strained, a brittle thing. "Apologize? Buddy, the only one apologizing will be you to the floor when I introduce you to it." What no one in that gym, least of all the arrogant man in the white gi, could comprehend was that they were not looking at James Washington, the janitor. They were standing in the presence of James Silent Storm Washington, the 5-time undefeated world mixed martial arts champion, a living legend who had vanished from the face of the earth 2 decades prior. He had retired at the absolute zenith of his career, haunted by an accident that had claimed the life of his best friend, his brother in arms. He had made a solemn vow to never raise his fists in combat again. But some vows, when tested against the raw steel of a man's dignity, are destined to be broken. Derek adjusted his black belt with a flourish, soaking in the attention of his captive audience. "Gather round, everyone," he commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are about to witness a practical lesson in social order, a clear demonstration of why some men lead and others follow." He gestured grandly towards James. "Here we have a perfect specimen of someone who has failed to grasp that there are designated spaces for certain kinds of people. An elite martial arts academy is not the place for, well, you understand." The thinly veiled racism hung in the air, acrid and suffocating. For James, it was a sickeningly familiar poison. It was the same venom he'd heard whispered in locker rooms and shouted from the cheap seats 20 years ago. Insidious remarks about fighters who didn't fit the stereotypical champion's mold. But the James of 42 was not the hot-headed youth of 20. He had learned the hard alchemy of turning raw rage into a cold, focused energy, something far more potent than a simple punch. "Sensei Derek?" A voice cut through the tension. It was Sarah Chun, the young woman with the tight bun. She was a purple belt in jiu-jitsu and, unbeknownst to Derek, a master's student in sports psychology, currently writing her thesis on discrimination and microaggressions in athletic environments. "Perhaps we could just continue with our regular training? It's getting rather late." Derek rounded on her, his face a mask of irritation. "And Sarah Chun, are you now questioning my pedagogical methods?" he snapped, using her full name as a tool of intimidation. "Sit down and watch. You will learn more about the reality of power in the next 5 minutes than in a month of your katas." James saw the fear in Sarah's eyes, but also a spark of defiance. It was the same look he remembered seeing in the mirror decades ago, waking in a cold sweat, the ghost of Tony, the hammer, Rodriguez looming in his memory, his best friend, his sparring partner. Dead. Because of him. A flurry of punches thrown with too much force during a sparring session fueled by the racist taunts of the crowd that night. Tony had gone down, his head striking the canvas at a fatal, unforgiving angle. He never woke up. The official inquiry ruled it a tragic accident, a freak occurrence. But James knew the truth. He had lost control, and the price was a life he could never recover. "So, Janitor," Derek sneered, circling him now like a hyena sizing up its prey. "Ready to show us your famous mop-pushing guard?" The forced laughter of the students was weaker this time, more like a nervous cough. James closed his eyes. The gym in Denver dissolved. He was back in the blinding lights of the MGM Grand in Las Vegas 22 years ago, the roar of the crowd a physical force. He could hear the slurs from the stands before his title defense against Victor the Demolition Man, Petrov. "Look at the little black boy," a voice had slithered from the darkness. "I give him 3 rounds before a real fighter puts him down." He had won that fight with a technical knockout in the second round, but the victory was hollow. The pressure, the racist vitriol had coiled inside him like a serpent, and days later it had struck, poisoning the sanctity of his training and killing his best friend. Another ghost surfaced, his younger sister, Kesha. Fearless, brilliant Kesha, who had the same fire he saw in Sarah Chun's eyes. She'd been killed at 17, caught in the crossfire of a police shootout in their neighborhood, a stray bullet extinguishing her bright future. James had been in Japan, chasing glory when he got the news. Another soul he loved, lost while he was a world away, playing a violent game. It was the final straw, the catalyst for his disappearance into the anonymous, simple life he now led. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Derek taunted, his arrogance a shield against the unsettling stillness of the man before him. He made his critical error. He punctuated the insult with a light shove to James's shoulder. It was a casual act of disrespect, the kind a man who has never faced true consequences for his actions commits without a second thought. The push landed, and nothing happened. James didn't move a single inch. It was like shoving a granite statue. His feet seemed to be extensions of the foundation of the building itself. Derek felt a jolt run up his arm as if he had punched a concrete wall. The smug smile on his face faltered, flickering like a faulty bulb. Interesting, James murmured, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent gym. It's been a long time since anyone has been that foolish. There was a tonal shift in his voice, a subtle change in the atmosphere of the room. It wasn't anger. It was something far more chilling. It was the absolute, unshakable calm of a man who has stared into the abyss and was not impressed by the shadows. Last chance, janitor, Derek blustered, his voice now tight with irritation. Accept the demonstration, or I'll have security throw you out, and you can kiss your little job goodbye. James opened his eyes, and the dragon that Derek had mistaken for a lizard finally awoke. The sensei felt a primal fear, a cold dread that snaked up his spine and coiled in the pit of his stomach. All right, James said, his voice now imbued with an authority that commanded instant silence. But before we begin, I want you to look at Sarah Chun. I want you to apologize for attempting to silence her. Then I want you to apologize to the rest of your students for turning this dojo into a stage for your own pathetic ego. And then James did something utterly unexpected. He smiled. Not a smile of submission or nervousness, but a slow, confident smile that spread across his face like the dawn. It was the smile of a man who had just remembered who he was and had just found a cause worthy of breaking a 20-year vow. You dare lecture me? Derek roared, his face crimson with a mixture of rage and humiliation. He dropped into his preferred fighting stance, a classic by-the-book posture. I will teach you respect. James took a single step forward, and in that instant, his entire being transformed. His shoulders settled, his center of gravity dropped, and his feet shifted into a stance of such perfect balance and readiness that it was a work of art. Any seasoned fighter would have recognized it instantly as the mark of a true master. Actually, James said, his voice still impossibly calm, I know precisely what a dojo is. And I know that this place ceased to be one the moment you decided to use it to humiliate a man who was simply doing his job. From the side, Sarah Chun's eyes widened. She had spent years studying videos of the great masters for her research. The economy of movement, the serene and controlled breathing, the aura of contained power radiating from the janitor. It was all there. It was like watching a historical documentary come to life. Meanwhile, her phone had finished its search. Las Vegas National Gym. The result sent a wave of ice through her veins. It wasn't a weekend boot camp. It was the legendary training ground for the world's most elite MMA champions of the last 3 decades. Last chance, Derek, James offered, his tone almost gentle. Apologize. Pride, that most blinding of human follies, made Derek's choice for him. He attacked. His first punch was a jab, technically flawless, fast and straight. It was a punch that had connected with 99% of his opponents. But James Washington was the 1%. With a movement so fluid it seemed to defy physics, he was simply no longer there. He had swayed to the side, a reed in the wind, and Derek's fist sliced through empty air, throwing him off balance. Clean technique, James observed, already repositioned. But you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder. A critical tell. Derek spun around, bewildered. Beginner's luck, he spat, and launched his signature combination. A rapid-fire jab straight hook sequence that he had used to end countless spars. Again, it was like striking at a phantom. James ducked under the jab, the punch whispering over his hair. He leaned back in an arc that seemed to defy gravity, the straight punch missing by a mile. As the hook came whistling towards his chin, he took a single, precise step back, and the punch expended its force on nothingness. An interesting combination, James said, his breathing still perfectly even. Effective against a static target. But you leave your entire left side catastrophically exposed after the hook. Sweat was now beading on Derek's brow. Panic was beginning to fray the edges of his composure. Stand still and fight, he bellowed, launching a wild, desperate flurry of strikes. James decided the lesson was over. He flowed through the storm of attacks, untouched, and then, in the blink of an eye, the distance between them collapsed. One moment Derek was flailing at air, the next James was standing directly in front of him, close enough to touch. How? Derek whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. You want to know the difference, Derek? James asked softly. The difference between a gym fighter and a professional champion? Before Derek could even process the question, James acted. There was no wind-up, no overt display of force. He simply placed the palm of his right hand on Derek's chest, and Derek flew. It wasn't a push, it was a propulsion. He was launched backwards as if struck by a cannonball, his feet leaving the mat entirely. He sailed through the air for several feet before landing flat on his back with a resounding thud that echoed the finality of his defeat. The silence in the gym was absolute, broken only by the sound of Derek gasping for air, staring at the ceiling in utter shock. There was no pain, just the overwhelming, undeniable reality of a force he could not comprehend. Sarah Chun finally let out the breath she had been holding. She had never, in all her years of study, witnessed such a perfect, devastating, and yet controlled application of power. It was not brutality, it was art. James walked over and extended a hand to the fallen instructor. It's quite simple, really, he said calmly. Leverage, timing, and the transfer of kinetic energy. Principles I honed over a 22-year professional career. Derek ignored the hand and staggered to his feet. 22-year career in what? He rasped. It was Sarah who answered, her voice trembling slightly as she held up her phone, the screen glowing with the truth. You really don't know who this is, do you? She read from an article on the screen, her voice gaining strength with each word. James Washington, also known as Silent Storm, 5-time undefeated world mixed martial arts champion, considered by many experts to be one of the greatest technical fighters in the history of the sport. Retired at age 29 after a tragic accident in training resulted in the death of his sparring partner. The words detonated in the room. Derek's face went white, the blood draining from it as the colossal, humiliating truth crashed down upon him. He had not just challenged a janitor, he had publicly taunted and attacked a living icon of the very art he claimed to master. 5-time world champion? Derek stammered, his arrogance dissolving into a puddle of shame at his feet. James nodded. I retired a long time ago. Needed a simple life. No cameras, no fame. No need to prove anything to anyone. The transformation in Derek was stark and painful. The bully was gone, replaced by a man crushed by the weight of his own monumental ignorance and disrespect. I had no idea, he whispered. If I had known who you were... If you had known, James interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, you would have treated me with respect. But what about the next janitor? The next person you deem to be beneath you? Would you have shown them the same courtesy? The question struck home, a blow far more damaging than any physical strike. Derek looked at his students, truly seeing them for the first time. He saw their disappointment, their disillusionment. He saw the respect he had so desperately craved evaporate before his very eyes. James, he said, his voice thick with a humility that was entirely new to him. I am truly sorry. To you. To Sarah. To everyone. There is no excuse for my actions. 3 months later, the dojo was a different place. The viral video of the incident, discreetly filmed by Sarah, had torched Derek's reputation. He lost most of his students and was now teaching a small class at a community center, a man humbled by public disgrace. At the old gym, now under new, enlightened ownership, Sensei James had become a permanent fixture. At Sarah's urging, he was hired as a special instructor, teaching not just advanced fighting techniques, but the philosophy of martial arts, discipline, humility, and respect. The greatest lesson, James would often tell his new students, is to never judge a book by its cover. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. True strength is not in the power of your fists, but in the character of your heart. Justice, he had learned, sometimes moves in silence, a quiet storm that reshapes the landscape without a single clap of thunder.